What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Meaning of Podcast. I'm RB3.
I'm Sabrina.
And we are back talking about Neo-Noir. I know it's been a couple weeks since we had our noir episode, but we are back talking about the genre, the classic genre of Neo-Noir, which is a reinterpretation of what we talked about last week, the noir genre that kind of spawned in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And this is kind of like everything in that genre, but post like the time period and context and all that. So it kind of, we're talking about films. We have an extensive amount of films that we can talk about here, including, some French New Wave stuff like Les Samurai, to American hits like, Chinatown, to science fiction like Blade Runner, to cartoons like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which we talked about on our Robert Zemeckis episode. All of these films encompass neo-noir because they are retaking the tropes of the noir genre and recontextualizing them into a modern or contemporary context. So, Sabrina, before we get fully into the discussion, what are your thoughts on the neo-noir genre?
I was actually way more familiar with the neo-noir genre than I was with noir, especially growing up because we watched films like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Blade Runner. So that was something that I dove into a little bit more because I feel like a lot of films kind of fall under this umbrella of being neo-noir, stuff that you wouldn't even kind of think about. Like, obviously there's the obvious ones like Drive, but then we have stuff like Under the Silver Lake, like little pieces taking some of those tropes that we talked about in our last episode and really modernizing it and kind of changing it to fit the narrative of that specific film. So we see like Blade Runner taking place in a dystopian type of environment, but taking all of the ideas that are presented in the noir genre, having that type of protagonist, having the situations, the femme fatales, something that we see prevalent in that one and Blade Runner 2049. So I really, really enjoy this genre because even films like The Matrix, like there's so many different ones that kind of fall under this category. So I think it's an exciting one to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we discussed a few during the prep of this episode that kind of, I think, highlights a lot of the various ones, but all the various types of ways that neo-noir is kind of interpreted. But one that I always kind of stick back to is Nightcrawler. I feel like Nightcrawler is like a very you talked about Drive. That's more of it's also a great neo-noir, but it's also very action oriented. It's more of an action vein, whereas I think Nightcrawler is more along in the psychological drama aspect of it. And it really, to me, Nightcrawler stands out to me as a perfect neo-noir because it kind of takes every trope and flips it on its head in a way that is subversive, but also it kind of masks neo-noirisms while still taking like the kind of aesthetic of neo-noir. Because while noir is starkly black and white and starkly like harsh shadows and all that stuff, neo-noir encompasses a lot of that stuff. But a lot of neo-noir films, not all of them, but a lot of neo-noir films are in color. So a lot of times there's stark colors, high contrasty colors, high saturated colors. I think when I think of Nightcrawler, I think of that like iconic red car with like that dark sky and the green light that shines off of Jake Gyllenhaal's face, like all of these like really like intense, vibrant colors to put you into the mix of this world of darkness and ugliness, and the darkness surrounding the colors make them pop even more. And I think Sin City is another film that kind of takes that to the whole nother level, right? Now that does a more direct, like black and white, kind of really trying to lean into the noir style. But the comic book that it was based on by Frank Miller was taking from that genre as well. So it kind of reinterprets that, but it takes that whole idea of like the popping of the colors to a whole different level. But going back to Nightcrawler, I also think, when you talk about like the femme fatale, like the whole idea of Rene Russo's character, when you first meet her, you think she's like a femme fatale, right? She's like the head of like this news company, and like she, is pretty much promoting like violence and ugliness and all this kind of stuff. So you think, she is ultimately the one who is, kind of the orchestrator of the bad in this movie, but it's all really inside of Jake Gyllenhaal's mind. Like he goes to the extreme. He purposefully goes to the extreme to get like those like really intense, like Nightcrawler news footage kind of stuff. And then, even to a point where she's like, hey, you got to chill out. And he starts berating her. Like he literally threatens her and blackmails her and pretty much like sexually harasses her. So I think Nightcrawler is a perfect example of how the neo-noir genre can be recontextualized, not only through an entire genre, but within a particular character's perspective.
Yeah, I think Nightcrawler is kind of a perfect example of that, because it takes everything that we talked about and then elevates it and changes it just a little bit. And that's what I really think about neo-noir. They're not just following everything that's in the path, they are kind of adapting it to their own narratives. So we have with Nightcrawler, Jake Gyllenhaal's like moral gray area. He's not, we don't root for him throughout this entire thing, and his obsession and his ambition definitely gets in the way of so much in his life, and it very, very much so is something that he brings upon himself, and the pressure that he's putting on himself to succeed in this way, even losing his partner, and he purposely does so. There's so many moments like that where we see it, and yeah, it's not guided by the femme fatale, where it's kind of one of those situations where we're introduced to it, and then it subverts our expectations. And that's what keeps it fresh and interesting. That's kind of what I like about that one.
Yeah, 100%. I think, oops, sorry. Let me start that over. Yeah, 100%. I think that's why I personally, I'm attracted to that movie, and I think it's a really great film. I think, going back to the other one you mentioned, Drive, I think Drive is another great example of neo-noir because of how stylistic it is. Like Nicholas Winding Refn, to me, is one of my favorite filmmakers working, and I know he has some divisive stuff with Only God Forgives and Neon Demon. I actually like Neon Demon a whole lot. Not Only God Forgives, not that much, but I love Neon Demon, and I love Drive because it's just so bold, it's so stark, and I think it encompasses. I think Ryan Gosling's so good at playing like the neo-noir type of character, because he is like stoic, and he is like very he's amazingly talented, because he could be both amazingly expressive and funny and stuff like The Nice Guys, or a bigger like kind of movie, but then he could just do stuff like Blade Runner 2049 and Drive, where he's just kind of quiet and still, and you kind of just see the pain like laying under his eyes, and that's the kind of main character that we see in Drive is kind of the perfect like archetype for what we know about like the noir characterization of like the lead character, right? The stoic, the quiet, the very passive, but still is going to get to it. A hired gun, a hired killer. That's kind of a trope that we see throughout a lot of these films. The kind of gangster rooting like underneath. But I also like Drive because it has that like slight Hollywood angle. I think a lot of people forget that about it. Like it's the whole like stunt driver, like trying to get out of the stunt driving life, trying to, live his life right. But also the people he's working with is also sending him to do other kind of crazy jobs and robberies. And we get that amazing chase sequence like around Staples Center in downtown LA, which I thought was really, really dope. But yeah, talk to me a little bit about Drive, Sabrina. What kind of connection do you have to that movie?
Yeah, well, the first time that I saw it, it's exactly what you said. It has so much style, and it really just stood out from other films that I've seen kind of like this. I think Nicholas Winding Refn really, really encapsulated this type of story and portrayed it on screen so beautifully. I loved all the supporting characters and the cast. I loved Bryan Cranston, Carey Mulligan. I thought the way that they tied in that entire story, the way that they mixed in the action with the heart, and yeah, seeing Ryan Gosling, who we know as just being like a really, really talented actor, seeing him just kind of as the stoic character is something that I really admired. And I thought it was really great. I thought they handled the violence really well. I feel like for this type of genre of like an action drama, I really do think a lot of people can find a little bit in this to enjoy. It's not straight up like John Wick. It has a little bit more heart in that. So anybody who doesn't like full on action films, I feel like a lot of people can find a little bit to love in this one. So that's really what I loved about it. And I love that, again, showing us that gritty, seedy underbelly of the city. It's something that I always like to see in these types of films, kind of showing without the whole like Hollywood glamour aspect, really seeing what's behind it. Like we talked about with the Neo-Noir films from last week.
Between Nightcrawler and Drive and Chinatown, You know, these are all movies, and also Who Framed Roger Rabbit too, by the way, all movies that take place in Los Angeles, which is something we talked about in the noir episode. How a lot of times these noir films take place in like LA, New York, or Chicago, like heavily populated cities, heavily dense cities. Now, in the context of 2010s, 2020s, we're even further in that process, right? We're even further deep down in overpopulation, especially in LA. And I think, and Blade Runner, another LA set movie, definitely riffs on that too. So what are your kind of thoughts on, like, because I know you're not like LA born, Sabrina, but like, somebody from Chicago and coming to LA, like, what do you, when you watch like movies that kind of portray LA in a certain kind of way, does it present like this kind of feeling in your mind about the city, or does it, are you cognizant of like, the fact that it's just a movie and it's just the genre that they're kind of wrapped up in?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what we said about noir really encapsulating that time period. I feel like a lot of these films do the same when we talk about what's happening in the cities, especially when we talk about ones like Drive, where we have this finally, after all these decades of mistreatment of people behind the scenes, Hollywood has kind of had the curtain pulled down on them, and people who have done bad things in the past, or any kind of like gritty, nasty stuff that's happening behind the scenes, a lot of it is coming to surface. And so when I see something like that, I think it really just kind of shows the time period. And even when we highly glamorize something, there's always something behind it that is kind of taking that away. And I think that's very evident within Drive, within Under the Silver Lake, since we're talking about Los Angeles. That entire, like, every location in that film, that's all places that I've been to 100 times before. And I thought that was really interesting because that film actually purely focused on Hollywood and purely focused on like the rich of Los Angeles, people that were in the business, people that were even like businessmen and like, political figures, and just kind of showing how all of that meshes and how much corruption that there is behind the scenes. And so when I see that about Los Angeles, I think both you and I and a lot of people are very aware that these things kind of happen. So it's not shocking and it's not surprising to see it on screen, because it is slightly realistic. I mean, within Under the Silver Lake, when we're talking about political figures in Los Angeles, this rich cult, like we've seen stories over the last few decades of celebrities being in certain cults and kind of the 1% doing certain things that the public doesn't really know about. So I'm not saying Under the Silver Lake is 100% accurate, but I do feel like it portrays something that is very realistic.
Yeah, I think you're touching on something like very interesting, which I think is like the whole idea of like the class divide, right? Like in Los Angeles, I think that's one of the more developing kind of things that we see throughout the genre if we look at it over time, right? Because I think when, obviously we talked about the original noir genre kind of being birthed of this mixture of prohibition and depression and the Great Depression and World War II, coming out of post World War II. That's kind of, we saw the genre evolve through all of that time. And, when we see the depiction of Los Angeles, like you're talking about, you're right. There is a sort of a difference to it. You go back to the 1970s with Chinatown, and that was more explicitly about corruption, right? Specifically about like water corruption and like DWP and all this kind of stuff and like all that kind of stuff, which is funny because there is a lot of that currently happening now, like this whole like war over water. Like, California literally had a drought like I think like 10 years ago or something like that. And I mean, it's real stuff. I mean, but it goes on, you think something like water corruption wouldn't be like that big of a deal, but it actually does end up affecting people. And as we see at the end of Chinatown, it actually ends up literally, at least like the daughter of Nick Cross, or who's the main bad guy, ends up getting killed. So it's really tough and interesting when you think about it. But I think there's also another layer in it too, Sabrina, that you touched on, with like the recent like unveiling of like the misdoings of a lot of people in Hollywood, whether that's like through social activism or like the Me Too movement and all that kind of stuff. We've seen that kind of shift happen in LA too. And in a lot of ways, these movies were trying to tell us about a lot of that stuff even before a lot of those details became prevalent. And again, that's something that I think back to on movies like, you know, Sin City, that deal a lot like sexual perversion. You know, again, Chinatown, another one I referenced, again deals with those ones too, and Nightcrawler, another example. I think we see constant examples of like how our perception of society as like this broken, corrupt thing leads to like these broken and corrupt individuals. You know, either there's broken, corrupt individuals at top, and then the actions of those make the people at the bottom react differently too. And I think that's kind of a lot of the things we've seen in neo-noir. And kind of shifting the focus from LA a little bit, I'm gonna go to New York and kind of touch a little bit on Taxi Driver. Because I think Taxi Driver is another example of a film that kind of dives deep into the conditions of the system around somebody, right? Like this kind of like how, you know, we follow Travis Bickle, and he's like this really insane, twisted dude who can't process, you know, like the changes in government. Like he's literally he's like he takes the presidential candidate in his car, and he's like, I don't really have any political beliefs, but you know, I think the streets are nasty, filthy, people are filthy, nasty. And he's really a broken dude coming out of the war, coming out of Vietnam, and has this really disturbing and twisted philosophy on the world, so much so that he takes actions into his own hands. Talk to me a little bit about that one, Sabrina. I know Kate and myself talked a little bit about Taxi Driver on our Netflix Roulette episode on that movie. But you know, do you have a particular attachment to this film, or?
I enjoyed this film a lot. This wasn't one that I revisit a ton, but I do love its kind of portrayal of how society and the environments around you can cause you to go to extreme lengths. Not that we have sympathy, but we understand, even if we don't agree. It gives us that understanding, and I enjoy seeing kind of like breaking down these, the same way I said, like these highly like glamorized like cities. When you think of New York, you think of Times Square, and you think of Central Park and all of this beauty, but there really is a lot of darkness behind it, especially when you talk about crime. And going from New York, another one is Chicago. We saw kind of a modern noir with Widows, with Steve McQueen's Widows, and I absolutely loved that film. And I really, really, the first time I saw it, I thought about Billy Wilder. It was reminiscent to kind of his style of filmmaking with noir. And there's such a layered story within this, and it was handled so beautifully. And it shows that corruption, the difference with like Taxi Driver and Widows is that sometimes when somebody does like commit crimes or goes to extreme lengths, that could be because of their surroundings, and they could be like a Travis Bickle, or they could be like everybody in Widows. It is a little bit more glamorous. It's not the people that you would expect that are going through this. And I just love that because it has that gritty cynicism, and the dialogue was so quick and witty and fast, and Viola Davis was just absolutely incredible. Really everybody was with this film, and I think it was extremely underrated. And obviously it was very recent. I think it was only about 2 years ago. But I think that shows the difference that kind of noir laid the groundwork for certain aspects, and then a lot of these modern filmmakers are taking little bits and pieces and then really adding it into their own stories. So for this one, it shows that grittiness, even though the characters aren't going full Travis Bickle, like dirty, really affected by their surroundings. And it's very, very interesting. And it's kind of the thing with Under the Silver Lake too, circling back to that one, because I believe the main character's name is Sam, played by Andrew Garfield, and he has no job. He lives in Los Angeles. It's extremely expensive here. He's getting his car taken away. He's getting evicted. And then it's almost like to distract himself from the reality around him, because there's nothing that he can really do to change it. He ends up going on this kind of mystery journey and figuring out something that happened to his neighbor. And that's what I think we see with these protagonists. So noir laid the groundwork, and then all of these films take a bit of it and then make it their own. Like you said, with the science fiction aspect in Blade Runner, the comedy, the like weird elements of horror that's mixed in with Under the Silver Lake. It's stuff that you would definitely not see in film noir from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. But it's this modernized version of telling kind of what's happening with our society in our world over the last few decades. And that's something that I find to be really interesting.
100%. And, you know, I'm really glad you brought up Widows, because Widows, I think, is a brilliant neo-noir. I actually wrote a paper for it in my Hitchcock class, because we had to take like a modern film and compare it to, you know, a Hitchcock film. And to me, Widows is like the perfect example of something that is suspenseful, is, like you said, you said, encompasses the neo-noir tropes and genres, but also features a lot of social commentary. And again, going back to that corruption, when we see with Colin Farrell's character being like that politician who on his face, he's like, yeah, I'm all for black businesses, black jobs, all that. And then the second he gets into a car, he's slinging the N-word, like, you know, being super, super racist. And yeah, I think that underlying mistrust of government and systems, I think is something that was rooted in noir, with the whole against prohibition and against the Great Depression, like that kind of feeling that birthed, not against, but birthed in those conditions. I think neo-noir is birthed in the conditions of anti-corruption, or not anti-corruptions, but is born in the realm of corruption, of class inequality, and of mad other circumstances. So we're going to talk about more of neo-noir and more of those circumstances when we get back from the break. And we're also going to have a lot more movies to talk about too, so make sure y'all stick around.
This ain't funny, so don't you dare laugh. With the 4/5 divide you in half. You getting at me equals a bloodbath. You do the math, take you out the equation. It's a masterpiece, baby.
It's perfect. I love it. It's amazing.
It's beautiful. Baby, listen, we gotta get ready for work. Love you, baby.
What? Work? Yeah. What happened to going to the science fair? Jackie, if you don't get your...
Look, she's not answering. We gotta go.
30 seconds.
Jackie, hide!
All right, let's go save some parents.
I've seen my parents die 277 times.
I noticed on today's attempt, the gravitational field declined by 50%. And I'm worried you only have like 2 attempts left.
I might just have to go in.
Into the house. With armed robbers. It's too dangerous.
I'm not willing to waste the last 2.
Check out our new website on geeksofcolor.co/first-cut to check out our reviews, our videos, and articles that pertain to everything First Cut related. Check it out.
Come along, children. Now we're going to have a little music.
What is up, y'all? We are back talking about neo-noir. We had a great conversation in the first half about the genre and a lot of the movies. Now we could just talk about more movies. I think the neo-noir genre is just like sprawling and epic, and a lot of ways it can encompass other things like horror, sometimes mystery. I know last week, Sabrina, you mentioned some David Fincher with Seven in there. That could be a little bit of like a neo-noir with, the crime mystery genre as well in there too. So is there any other movies that you think stand out in your mind as quintessential neo-noir?
Yeah, another really great one that I really enjoyed when it came out, and I feel like it was super underrated, was Bad Times the El Royale, Drew Goddard's film. I think that he really, really, I think it subverts a little bit away from what we see as the typical noir. And obviously we have a lot of characters, even with our protagonists, like Cynthia Erivo, to me, was kind of like the standout within this film. But every single character has an entire backstory, and we're introduced to every single person, whether it's John Hamm, Chris Hemsworth, including like a cult taking place in the 70s on like the California-Nevada border. There's so much in this one to kind of unpack, and it takes so many twists and turns. It's a little over 2 hours, definitely very long, but there's so much story to kind of unravel with this one.
Yeah, no, 100%. I love Bad Times at El Royale. I actually watched that one on the plane. I actually think I literally watched that on the plane going to Chicago for the Schmodown trip last year. Yeah. I really do enjoy that movie. And I think, Jeff Bridges, it's funny with that movie because you go into it thinking Jeff Bridges is, just a quiet old pastor, saint, dude who like a religious dude. But then, you find out as the movie goes along, we're not going to spoil, things, obviously. His character has some stuff going on. Chris Hemsworth's character ends up coming along and playing a really interesting part of the picture. But yeah, you're right. Cynthia Erivo. This is the first movie I actually saw her do the singing thing. And like, there's a moment where she's in a room just kind of singing by herself, and you're just like, whoa, like she is extremely, excessively talented. And even the other characters in the movie say as much, So, but yeah, I like that, and I think that again, that's another great neo-noir, that kind of very, again, dense colors, bold colors, like the motel they're staying in has a very like multi kind of layered, like, kind of production design. Like there's like when you go into, because the whole idea is that is in the El Royale is supposed to be right in between the middle of California and Nevada, if I'm not mistaken. So there's literally one half of the hotel that's like a California theme, and the other side that's like a Nevada theme. And it is really, I think the production design is just really cool. And I think that's also a piece of neo-noir. I think that's also a piece of neo-noir that we didn't touch on, right? Like how noir is we talked about like the German expressionism, like inspirations, like how it's very stylized. And I think neo-noir finds stylization, and a lot of German expressionism and a lot of noir films found the expression through production design because they're in black and white. So the stuff in the background and the foreground really mattered a lot. So the style upped it up. And Maltese Falcon, again, we mentioned last week, is a perfect example of that. But I think this, I think Bad Times at El Royale is a perfect example of the production design in neo-noir, because it is over the top and expressionist. Like the location very much stands out, even in this kind of containment thriller-ish kind of thing. But then it's still very bold, and you kind of can see based on who's who, like and the film, you kind of identify what their characterization is based on where they are in the story. So.
Yeah, and there's a complete mix of all different people staying at this hotel from all different backgrounds, all with their own stories. And even Louis Pullman, who was a huge standout, who kind of played like the front desk, like concierge guy at the hotel. Even he explicitly states, like, Father, like, this isn't a place for you, because he understands even not taking place in a city like New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles, but taking place in kind of this middle of nowhere type of town right on the border. They have so much corruption. They know people are going there to hide away. This kind of is this cool little luxury place. And they even allude to having like JFK and Marilyn Monroe tapes. And that's something that we realize all the people who are running the hotel are actually spying on the politicians and the celebrities and anyone else that's staying there. And we get those crazy scenes where we're just going room to room and we have the windows into every single person's. And that's how they kind of introduce the backgrounds of all the different characters. We have Cynthia Erivo singing, and it adds this beautiful layer to the entire scene, super haunting, because she's just in her room singing and not expecting somebody to be walking around. And then they go to Dakota Johnson's room, and he's just passing by in a long hallway and seeing everything that's happening. And I just really, really love the way that he told this story with this kind of cast of characters, this range of talent, and taking place in a different type of environment than we're typically used to seeing in noir or in a lot of neo-noir.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think Bad Times at the El Royale like perfectly encompasses, like you said, that suspenseful, like not knowing who's watching you kind of thing. And I think that's the key part of noir too. And I think that's something that I personally feel like Who Framed Roger Rabbit also did a pretty good job at too, right? It kind of take a shift more in the more comedic, cartoony side. But I mean, that plays directly on noir, just through the time period, the aesthetic, like through the, it's literally like they're doing that whole like Eddie Valiant was a private detective. Like they're literally doing that like through this movie. So it's kind of playing a riff on it. It's kind of satirizing it. but there is kind of like this overarching theme throughout that movie of being watched, being, you know, I mean, obviously they're cartoons, so like they are meant to be watched, but, you know, they have like this Toonland thing that they are trying to tear down, so in order to build a freeway. And it's kind of this idea of like Big Brother taking away from the community in order to serve some sort of some sort of interest, some sort of mass interest or something like that. So I think, you know, I think that this movie, I think Who Framed Roger Rabbit kind of touches on that a lot. I think it also does a really brilliant job of having a lot of the tropes that we see in Neo-Noir, but kind of keeping them kid friendly and keeping them kind of innocent. Like they're like, you know, obviously I'm a big fan of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I've dressed as Roger Rabbit, and I was Destiny did Jessica for Halloween. So we're big fans of it, but it's funny because like Jessica in this movie could have been like a femme fatale kind of thing too, and they kind of like set that up a little bit, like with the whole her cheating and playing patty cake with somebody else or whatever. But at the end of the day, her heart's like full of gold, and like, you know, so same with Roger. Like even though Roger is kind of a goofy, silly side character almost in this movie, he's still at the end of the day is like a really, really, you know, charismatic dude. And then you get like the traditional private detective dude with like Eddie Valiant, who's played by the late great, oh man, why am I forgetting his name?
Bob Hoskins.
Bob Hopkins. There we go. I was gonna say Bob Harper. I kept thinking Bob Harper for some reason. Bob Hopkins. Yeah. So, yeah, I kind of think that's one of my favorite neo-noir films too, because it does take the genre, it flips it, and it also makes it accessible. And for me personally, I probably wouldn't have known about what a lot of neo-noir was without this film. Also, too, the music and Who Framed Roger Rabbit, I think, is really great, and that's something we didn't speak on in Taxi Driver, but you know, Taxi Driver, I think the music in Taxi Driver heavily emphasizes the noir genre and context that it is, thanks largely to Bernard Herrmann, who, you know, Taxi Driver was his last score that he did before he passed away in 1976. But Who Framed Roger Rabbit has a great score. Blade Runner, the score by Vangelis, is an amazing neo-noir score, which you can actually watch a video essay on and from Nerdwriter. Nerdwriter did a great video essay as to why the music in Blade Runner makes it so much of a neo-noir too. But yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Sabrina? I know we talked about it in our Robert Zemeckis episode a little bit, but
yeah, I remember seeing this movie when I was a kid, and I feel like this is kind of, for anybody that's in our age range, this is probably the first type of neo-noir, noir-esque film that we're kind of introduced to, because like you said, it really is accessible. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a kid's film. Everyone can enjoy it. So you're able to watch it, and there's certain jokes and certain moments that you won't necessarily get when you're a kid. But that just makes it age better as you age along with the film, from the first time you see it to later on in your life. And I love how it takes this like live action animated, mix and approach. And that's something we talked about with the Zemeckis episode. And that's what makes it stand out. But yes, mentioning like the visual effects in this film do so much. Every single part of it really is just, it's another tool and it's another thing to carry the film to make it what it is. And being very, very self-aware of the kind of film that it's creating, like having all of those noir aspects I really love, and the music is incredible. That's another thing that I really do love about certain neo-noirs, because when we're talking about neo-noirs, there's so many different types of films that we could talk about. Like you mentioned with Seven, like we've already mentioned with the list earlier on in the episode, but even like Under the Silver Lake as well has an incredible score, incredible soundtrack. And I feel like that really sets up the tone for what the film is, because even though it's a neo-noir, a lot of these are going in a bunch of different directions. And so I love the aspect with Who Framed Roger Rabbit of having this more fantasy approach, having it be very accessible, not super, super dark, but still having, a lot of conversation about what's happening and kind of the significance of what it is, especially in the time that it came out and still being relevant today.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny because it came out in the 80s, and that is definitely a time period that is definitely, especially, the later 80s, in American history, it was kind of seen as more of a positive time, more of an upbeat time. People look to the 80s for a lot of nostalgic reasons. But I think, you know, one of the fascinating things that they touch on in Roger Rabbit is like the evolution of society and like technology, right? And like the whole idea of like, oh, like tunes are out of business, like, you know, talkies, like they're worried about literally like talkies going out. Like this is, well, I think this movie takes place in the post-sound Hollywood, but it's, you know, we literally see like silent stars like singing like in bar rooms and stuff and talking about how they couldn't make it because they were because they faded out and all that kind of stuff. And how you know, they're taking precedence over building a freeway as to actually preserving the art of the cartoons and the entertainment industry. I think that's a really relevant commentary that I think it was something that was kind of happening in the 80s. I mean, in the 80s, we saw a lot of big companies start to monopolize upon themselves. You know, Coca-Cola buying movie studios. Like there was literally so much consolidation happening in the world in general. I think it's just funny that Roger Rabbit being such a kid-friendly Disney movie, pretty much, it still ends up encompassing the neo-noir idea of the social commentary, but in a way that isn't necessarily about like corruption. I guess in a way it is about corruption, but in
very
a
accessible way of talking about it, though.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. So that's one that, for me, that always sticks out. One that we didn't touch on before in the first half too was Sin City. You know, I really enjoy this movie, and we talked, you know, me and Andres had a Robert Rodriguez episode too, where we talked about this movie as well. But, you know, this film is pretty much starkly taking from noir, like pretty much through and through, because of the graphic novel that's based on. But Robert Rodriguez has a very like heavy-handed style, not in a bad way, of portraying it, and I think that is dynamic and is fun, and it resonates with a lot of people. I don't know if you've seen. I know you've seen this movie, Sabrina, but I mean, like, you have, you know, what are your thoughts on it as a piece of this genre?
Well, I think visually, with a lot of the ones that we're talking about, they all kind of stand out in their own way, and I think this one visually stands out because it's taking so much. This is when we're talking about like the straightforward neo-noir, when we're talking about the modern noir, and it takes so much from the original genre. I feel like this is a very true version of a noir, and I kind of like the way the structure is with the storytelling, the ensemble that it has, because when we look at noir, really like in our last episode, it really only focused on a few characters and then an overall idea, whether it was corruption or it was crime or something like that. They always just felt a little bit smaller, a little bit tighter, very, very quick. This, obviously, we have a larger ensemble. We have like an A-list cast, and there's a lot of stories told throughout. So it kind of reminds me of Bad Times at the El Royale in that way, where they take noir, but apply it to a very large group of people and kind of cover even like a larger range of ideas within that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I really dig this movie. Like you said, the style is big, the style is over the top, but also, you know, as much as it is in black and white, it still feels very like modern too. You know what I mean? Like it still feels very much like of, you know, because when you watch, you know, it's funny too, because sometimes when I watch noir movies, sometimes I'm like, I can easily see this being released in like, you know, a previous time period or something like that. But I can't even imagine if you were to put Sin City in a theaters back in like the 1940s, how that will play, because this movie is gruesome, it's tough, like it's, you know, and it takes the style and the black and white of noir genre, but it definitely doesn't take like the subtlety. And, you know, obviously we talked a little bit about the code, like the Hollywood production code back in our last episode, and how that affected the noir genre, how there was kind of a pre-code noir and a post-code noir, and the post-code noir is a little more cleaner, a little more Hollywood friendly, but still preserve those elements of darkness. This is definitely not like Hollywood or family friendly or anything like that. You know, it deals with things that are like killers, with rapes and you know, potential like suicides and mental illness, like, you know, especially also the second one too, A Dame to Kill For, definitely touches on a lot of subjects that I think are brisky. Frank Miller is an artist who's kind of style, or as a comic book writer, is very much like, let's give him the most gruesome, the most over the top, the most like in your face kind of stuff. And I think this is just translated in this film. So
I've never seen the second part. How does it hold up compared to the first? Do you like it just as much?
I don't honestly. It falls a little short. Like, I do like Joseph Gordon-Levitt's storyline in the second one was actually really cool, because that actually felt like a more of a traditional noir storyline. But I think, Sin City follows multiple characters and multiple stories, like, and kind of weaves them in at the end. I think it kind of does it really gracefully, and I think it subverts like the timeline and the chronology really well. I don't think the second one does that as much, and I don't think I don't think it's as well put together as the previous one was. But
yeah, because I was thinking of watching that for this one, so maybe I'll check it out after this, and I'll text you.
You should, I would recommend it as a standalone movie for sure. And I think it definitely succeeds Sin City and like the visual style. But it's funny because Sin City came out in 2005. It was so like remarkably groundbreaking, a lot of kind of stuff. And so much so that no movie really copied it like that much. We saw black and white movies, come out since, but we haven't seen it copied that much. But I think Sin City 2 definitely, if you're looking for that same flavor of style, is right there for sure. But speaking of like the kind of telling stories like non-linearly and temporal like manipulation, one last neo-noir film I kind of want to touch on is Following from Christopher Nolan. Now this was, if I'm not mistaken, Nolan's literal first feature debut. And it's really short. It's only like an hour and like 5 minutes or an hour and 10 minutes or something like that. And it's basically about this dude who, I don't think they even named the character in the film. He's like a writer he's following a burglar who goes into different houses and doesn't necessarily just steal things. He just kind of lives in these people's like worlds or whatever. So and like classic Nolan tradition, there's like it's not told literally, like not told linearly. Sorry. So where you're not getting like a clear picture of what's happening really until the very end. But it's funny seeing how this kind of, like we saw in like Sunset Boulevard and a lot of other noir films, this kind of trope of the writer, right? And like how a writer kind of falls into like this life of crime and mischief and all that kind of stuff. And this is a character who is seemingly like not that like well put together or whatever, who just kind of is living life in a shabby way. And so he meets this burglar dude and he's like, oh, finally I have something exciting to like get into. What are your thoughts on that, Sabrina, as a writer? Like, do you think these depictions of writers in these movies, is it fair? Is it good? Is it just like, what do you think?
I think I like that you're focusing on like the writer for this, so I'll mention that first. I understand why that would kind of be one of those examples to use. I understand why a writer would have so much curiosity, because when you're writing, especially a particular way, if you're writing fiction or you're writing nonfiction or you're really focusing on a specific subject and it's something that you've never experienced before, sometimes you want to be as fully immersed into just others' lives. I feel like that's in a lot of art, that's what we find. You could even talk about it with Nightcrawler, with Jake Gyllenhaal, like the ambition to do what he does more and more and more. It just kind of drives you crazy to have that certain ambition. So obviously he starts off small and he's, it almost feels like he's doing more of like research purposes. Like if you're writing a story, you want it to be like as authentic. You really want to understand like other humans. And if you don't have an opportunity to be around a lot of humans, a lot of different kind of humans all day and really learn their stories, it can feel disingenuous and not really authentic. And I feel like any artist, any creative person kind of struggles at some point with something along those lines, when you want to be as authentic as possible. And sometimes you just strive for something that There's other ways you could do it. Like you could just go to a bar and just talk to random people and hear other stories. But I actually really like that aspect. I like the idea of someone just immersing themselves into other people's worlds because they want to like improve as a writer. Obviously he's looking for inspiration for his novel. There's easier ways to find it. You don't have to commit crimes, guys.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an easier way to get involved in the head of somebody without, you know, going and enacting crimes with them. But I think, you know, it's funny because with this film, you know, I feel like Nolan, I mean, his characters are very stoic, very like kind of like shy, very kind of like intellectuals, but like not very social people. So I feel like, you know, having this character be so easily persuaded by this dude who's like burglarizing, whose name, by the way, is Cobb, which is, you know, comes back later in Inception. This is Leonardo DiCaprio's name. The burglar in this movie is named Cobb. You know, there's a lot of theories about following too. Like, you know, there's a segment in the movie where they actually rob his own house, right? Like he actually sets it up to where he robs his own house, and then Cobb is giving him this kind of commentary of like, whoever's living here is living like a really shabby life, really terrible, you know, kind of lifestyle or whatever. Like, it uses that kind of trope of deceit of one character knowing something that another character doesn't know, on top of Nolan's style of like not giving you the story in a particular linear storyline. It does that not just for the sake of manipulating time, but I think also to give you an idea of what a lie feels like cinematically. And I know it's kind of like a big like kind of statement, but I think that is what's kind of in play here, because you have one character who seemingly has like no identity. He's basically like a placeholder and for the audience to kind of get behind. As the story goes forward, you start to learn more about Cobb's like kind of true motivations in this. And again, I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't seen Following, because I think it is actually a really, really brilliant film. But it kind of ends up becoming about how much the main character ends up lying to himself to convince himself that Cobb is actually on his team, that Cobb is actually a person who wants to help advance this character. But, you know, later on in the movie, we meet an actual femme fatale who comes into the play and actually does end up backstabbing and portraying the main protagonist character. But it's all in the form of an entire world being set around one guy, an entire world that one guy builds in his head that is completely untrue, like this kind of disillusionment and this attachment from reality. So
yeah, and I really like that because also like the same way you talked about, the main character is unnamed, and the only person that we really know is basically like Cobb. Every other person is like the blonde, this, that, like they're credited as not a particular name. And I like that because it kind of takes us away. It never like personalizes like each character, and we never really focus on that. And I think that's cool. And just as Christopher Nolan's debut, I think that's amazing. I think what he was able to do within this film, it's really the birth of what we see so much later on, kind of like how you mentioned with Inception and everything else, because of that kind of nonlinear structure that, of course, we later see in Memento. And I mean, for this really does go back to noirs, because noirs were like pretty low budget. Like it didn't take a lot to make a noir compared to other films. And that's the same way with this one. This one is not like a large ensemble like a Sin City or like a Bad Times that we just mentioned. This isn't like interweaving a lot of different storylines. This is definitely more of that straightforward. And that's kind of why I feel like Nightcrawler and this one would go hand in hand as a really great like double feature if you're into that right now. Because both of them are looking for something. They're searching for some type of inspiration, and then they get caught up in this world and they basically don't know how to stop. And so that's something I really, really admire about this film.
What this film, and I think what I think the entire neo-noir genre kind of proves is that you could find ways to tell the same kind of story, to have the same kind of tropes, and to embody the same kind of ideas within a genre, while also still making it feel entirely different, right? And of course, like, you know, we talked about Blade Runner being sci-fi, Sin City being a comic book movie, Roger Rabbit being a cartoon, and Taxi Driver being like a human drama kind of thing. And all of these films, all, you know, and Late Samurai, which we didn't talk about that much either, but maybe that'll be a separate discussion. I think you know, all of these films kind of incorporate a lot of the same stuff, a lot of same genre tropes, and a lot of the same ideas, but proves that it's about the form. It's about how you can interpret a story, you know, like how one person could see a script or an idea or I guess a character trope and create their own with it. And I think that's honestly the most inspiring part about neo-noir. That's why I personally love this genre. And I think, you know, I look forward to seeing any movies that come out, like, you know, that are influenced by this, because like you said, Widows recently was amazing. Bad Times was amazing. I'm trying to think of something that was like neo-noir flavor that kind of came out 2019, 2020. But, you know, I also think about a lot of TV too, which we talked about in the first episode, Breaking Bad. You know, funny enough, I've been watching P-Valley on Stars. And there's this, you know, you haven't seen, you might like that. It's about strippers, but, you know, they, you know, it's actually a really good drama series. But there's actually a scene in there. I was like, wow, this came like right out of a noir, like with you know, who's supposed to be the bad guy being pretty backlit and darkly shadowed, and then you see it cuts to the main character and they're just like worried, and they got like the blinds in their face or whatever, and you're just like, dang, like that's something that you'll see straight out of one of those movies. And I'm really appreciating that the style of the noir genre lives on throughout a lot of cinema.
Yeah, and just like you mentioned, you really can find your own in this genre as a filmmaker. A really talented filmmaker can take a lot of these tropes, 100% add their own identity, their own voice to this. And it's something that sometimes you won't even realize some things in neo-noir, like Seven. There's so many things that fall kind of under this category that are taking some of these elements. But like I said, all the praise to noir, all the praise for the filmmakers in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that really laid the groundwork for a lot of the stuff that we see today. You would never, like, Blade Runner is of course a noir or a neo-noir, but at the first and foremost, it's science fiction. It's a sci-fi film. But then when you really pay attention to all of that, it's so blatant throughout the entire film. So yeah, I think a lot of people watch neo-noir without realizing what neo-noir is, or even being aware of noir. A lot of, like, because Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049, not as much Blade Runner 2049, but both of these are considered to be like kind of like cult classics. You know, they have their audience, and especially Blade Runner from decades later, a lot of people still consider it to be their favorite movie of all time. We see a lot of that. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how much more we get to see, how much more growth we're going to see in decades to come, how we kind of encapsulate our time period into a film like this. Because I really do love how all of these throughout the last few decades really are snapshots of everything that's happening in society in that time, and focusing on really, really relevant commentary.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Well, do you have any other thoughts on neo-noir, Sabrina? Or
I'm Under the Silver Lake again, guys.
Yes.
Check it out. I think it's so weird, so interesting. I know we talked about it this episode, but that's something I would recommend for like the 2019-2020 neo-noir, because there's a lot of interesting stuff in that one too. But yeah,
yeah, absolutely. And with that being said, that was today's episode of the Meaning Up Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us in this post-Thanksgiving holiday season. I hope you're enjoying your long weekend. And, you know, NOIRvember is coming to an end. But, you know, we are celebrating this because Mank is coming out next week on Netflix. And we're actually having a very exciting episode of the Meaning Up Podcast next week. We're actually talking about Citizen Kane. And, you know, we might even throw a review of Mank in there too. So we might see. But if you like Citizen Kane, which is a highly noir influenced film, be sure to check that out next week for the Meaning Of podcast. With that being said, I'm RB3.
I'm Sabrina.
This has been the Meaning Of podcast. Be sure to follow us on social medias. Where can people find you, Sabrina?
You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at SabrinaXMonica, and then also on Twitter at SabrinaOnFilm, and the First Cut account, First Cut TMO, on Instagram and Twitter. Yes,
100%. And you can follow me at Director RB3. And if you want to follow Timestamp for updates, you can follow at Timestamp Film on Instagram, and at Timestamp Movie on Twitter. And you can also make sure to contribute to Johnny's new Seed and Spark campaign for cardboard castles. It's a really great project and really inclusive and all of that stuff too. That was the Meaning Of podcast. We're gonna do this one more time, Sabrina, because I don't know how to do an outro, but I'm RB3.
I'm Sabrina.
And we are peacing out. Peace out, y'all.